The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, my name is Laura Ramsey and I'm a VP of Marketing here at SYSPRO. I'm pleased to welcome you to our live webinar today, 5 Easy Warehouse Wins to Improve Inventory Management. Today's session will be recorded and everyone who registered will receive an email with a link to the on-demand version, as well as a copy of today's presentation slides. Our presentation today will run for about 25 or 30 minutes, and then we'll have time at the end for questions. So if you do have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to submit them through the questions panel on the GoToWebinar console, and we'll address them at the end of the session. I think most of you are familiar with SYSPRO, but you may not know that it's been designed so that it interacts with other purpose-built solutions to increase the value of your solution. While your ERP is your system of record and SYSPRO is specialization, our approach has always been to partner and integrate with other leading vendors who are experts in their respective fields. Our partners have deep functionality in their systems, and when integrated with SYSPRO, you can do some amazing things like manufacturing operations, document automation, tax compliance, automation analytics, and what we'll be speaking to about today, warehouse automation. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our presenter today, Ryan Winicke, who is the product manager at riteSOFT. Ryan helps customers and partners with the deployment of software solutions that automate and optimize warehouse and manufacturing operations. He's a computer information systems and business admin graduate from Bemidji State University, and he's here today to give you some quick wins to help you improve your inventory management. Hi, Ryan, how are you?
Doing well, and thank you for the introduction. And welcome everyone. I'm excited to be here today. Before we really dive into the topics, we just kind of want to get a better understanding of where everyone is at today. So we have a couple of quick polls. The first poll that we really want to focus on is how much warehouse and production staff turnover did you experience over the last year? So if you wouldn't mind just taking a look at that questionnaire and putting in your answers, we'll give you about 10 to 20 seconds here just to get your answers in. We're going to use some of this information as we continue to go through the presentation, just to tie back to some of the challenges that you guys might be facing. We'll give you just a few more seconds to get some of those results in. And then do you mind going ahead, once everybody's in, go ahead and launch those results so everybody can get a benchmark for where they're at in comparison? So it looks like people are a little bit all over the board in terms of their results in the turnover, which is actually fairly good news that we're a fair amount down in that 10% or less range, which is really good. During the COVID times, we were seeing a lot of different things. Moving on to the second question, what we want to take a look at is, what is the most important business challenge that you want to address in your warehouse in 2023? Now, I know a lot of these, if you want to go ahead and launch that, might be challenges that you're wanting to tackle, but we really want to just focus on what's the number one in your organization that you'd really like to focus on or are challenged with in your role today. So we'll give you another 10 to 20 seconds. And then if you want to go ahead, once everybody gets their results in, if you want to go ahead and launch those results so we can kind of take a quick look. All right, so a little bit all over the board, but it looks like definitely the picking and receiving efficiency in errors is definitely a big one that people are wanting to focus on, as well as tracking materials for WIP is another one. But we'll kind of cover all of these topics today and how they might apply to you as we're kind of going through this presentation and tie back some of those concepts that hopefully you'll be able to utilize and start to think about today to prepare yourself to help solve these challenges as we kind of go through things. So we all know labor shortages, high staff turnover, and all of the disruption that we've seen in the supply chain over the last few years have really impacted our ability as an organization. And basically, with that, what we really need to capitalize is making sure that our warehouse is organized and the available space, as well as making it easy for new employees to find that inventory, is more critical than ever. And the questions we really want to start by asking ourselves is, are you making the most of your warehouse space? Or when is the last time you maybe even reevaluated your warehouse layout and organization? I know one of our customers, a wood manufacturing company, recently maximized their finished goods warehouse. They actually went through and rearranged their whole finished goods warehouse in a weekend to optimize their space. They really focused on their pallet floor space, where they were storing and stacking those pallets on the floor. And to increase their usable floor space, they actually reduced the space between the rows by putting pallet rows back to back and then leaving a empty space between each of those every other, and actually decreased that row space size as well. And with doing this, they were actually able to see a 33% gain in the increase of their pallet floor space that they were using. So some of these changes may seem like small things, but they can actually make very big impacts to how you're utilizing that space within your warehouse. Now, this might not apply directly to you, but there's also similar things that you can do to apply those same concepts to your warehouse. Other things that customers have started to look at, many customers have started investing in vertical lift or automatic storage and retrieval systems to help maximize their vertical space and the usage of their current footprint in their facility. Others have went through and they've done a reorganization analysis to remap out their warehouse to change how they store those materials. But what we really want to talk about is, what are some of the easy, quick things that you can consider to maximize your warehouse workflow and efficiency? Some of the things to really focus on considering are, do you currently have your areas, aisles, rows, bins labeled to make it easier for operators to know where to put away or where to find items? Often customers are going to use those floor placards or overhead placards to really help identify these quickly and easily. And really, it's going to apply well for those new operators that are coming into your facility. The other thing to evaluate is, how do you have the areas of your warehouse organized in terms of your raw materials, your finished goods? Have you ran out of room and you're just starting to put things wherever you can find an open space and have been running like that for quite some time now? We all know during the COVID supply chain issues, it caused a lot of disruptions internally to inventory coming in and going out. And have you continued some of those habits as carryover from those impacts without stopping and reevaluating again? You want to really identify any potential unnecessary items or unnecessary use of your warehouse that might just be carryover from bad habits or employees past, or some of the challenges you might have faced earlier on. The other thing to really look at is, are you maximizing your space from a container perspective? Are you using the right sort of containers or shelving mechanisms and maximizing the space with what's going in there? For example, if you're a small parts manufacturer or distributor, you're going to store your items very differently than a metal fabricator or food manufacturer. Make sure you're using some of the industry-specific tactics that are going to help you maximize that space. The other thing you're going to want to do with that is making sure that you're optimizing how those products are fitting in each of those areas, and that they're going to be in the right areas when you need them. This one is probably one of my ones that I see such a disparity in between different customers. Is keeping it organized and clean can be difficult because we're all very busy and moving fast. But don't overlook making sure that your floor space is cleaned up and you're using it in the most active inventory ways. The 80-20 rule is often going to apply within your warehouse, and that floor space is key to that. Especially when you look at, if 80% of your activity is happening with the same 20% of items or areas, you want to make sure you're maximizing that utilization of those fast mover items within your warehouse. The last one, which actually ties back really well to the poll, and we'll talk a little bit more about this on the upcoming slides as well, is have you optimized the layout for your picking workflows to make sure it's fast and easy to pick through your high mover items? Are you labeling your bin locations in an alphanumeric logic to help optimize simple picking strategies without having to implement a full-blown warehouse solution or warehouse mapping solution? Have you implemented a process for replenishing those locations efficiently to make sure that stockouts in pick locations aren't going to slow your pickers down? Now, with a lot of these concepts, by all means, you can hire a consultant to help come in and take a look at your inventory and tear it down and reevaluate. But there's also a number of quick things like we talked about today that you can start to take advantage of. There's mapping tools that you can do. When's the last time you remapped your warehouse? To better understand the flow of everything. Those are some of those little things that if you break a little bit of time from it, you can start to see where you might have some optimization opportunities. We talked a little bit about this, but another way to help you win in boosting your order picking speed and accuracy. And like a lot of you mentioned, that's one of your big challenges that you're wanting to solve. One of the easiest ways to do this from an order picking side is to provide those pick suggestions or directing people what bin locations to pick from. Often those picking processes is going to be one of those most important business challenges that you have an opportunity to improve upon. So we want to talk about some of the simple things that you really can do to accomplish that. So with using SYSPRO and or a warehouse management software solution, you can really sort and display those orders for your operators, focusing from a bin first perspective with that bin location or allocated bin. As we talked about organizing your warehouse for picking, you can now start to take advantage of some of those layout decisions that you made to help guide those pickers on how to pick a sales order simply by sorting the sales order lines by a pick bin location or a default bin location. As long as you have those bin locations organized alphanumerically by aisle, row, section, and bin, you can now sort those sales order lines by that bin or default bin to guide those pickers through that fairly simple path. Now, this is not a full-blown solution, but it's going to be that simple first step towards that. It's not going to necessarily also apply to those pickers that have been there for 5+ years and they know the warehouse like the back of their hand. However, it's going to help a lot with those new pickers that are coming in and having to learn where things are very quickly. And come up to speed very quickly to keep that efficiency. We know the turnover is going to cause problems with people, so as simple as we can keep it for those users that are picking those orders, that's going to be our key goal as we're kind of going through and setting this up. Now, we talked about a warehouse solution. You don't even necessarily need a WMS solution to start taking advantage of this. If you're printing your pack slips out of SYSPRO today, rather than sorting by the sales order line number, if you sort by the default bin location or the allocated bin location, it's going to now sort those lines on that sales order in a logical flow for those operators to go through that picking process and mark them off as they're going through, rather than having to do it by quickly scanning the order and trying to guess where they should be going and marking them off one by one as they're going through. Another way to take advantage of some opportunities is to sort or group multiple orders into a single pick list for your operators. This can help consolidate those pick lists together, making it more efficient for those pickers to pick multiple order lines at the same time as they're going through the warehouse. Often, this is going to apply more towards your small part picking environments where you'll have multiple bins on a pick cart for each specific sales order. And then as the user's going through, they can pick all of these items that are already sorted by bin. And then as they pick them, they'll put them in the associated sales order bin on their cart. And then they'll get packed out at a pack desk or shipping desk later on. Another great way to improve picking accuracy and efficiency for some of the customers on the call that might say, all right, we don't allocate bins or lots ahead of time, is you can utilize things like suggested picks if you're using a solution, a WMS solution, And this particularly can be helpful for a lot of your food manufacturers who are tightly managing their inventory based on FIFO or FIFO practices. So when you don't allocate those bins or lots today in SYSPRO ahead of picking, you're able to still utilize those suggestions on the fly, allowing your users to not have to make a decision on what or where they should be picking from. I do also want to cover a question that actually came in earlier on about how some of these tips may apply in a low volume, high variety environment with random bin assignments. A lot of what we were previously just talking about is covering a more focused approach around high volume pick processing. And in the same sense, though, some of these concepts will still apply with that bin organization being the key, right? Uh, the low volume, high SKU environment, the challenge you're often going to face in that same sort of sense is where do I find these items? Because you're not picking the same items over and over again. They're stored in random locations and they're low amounts of the same SKUs. So utilizing bins within SYSPRO and providing easy access to that information in real time while your users are on the floor is going to help them stop the scavenger hunting for that one item and where somebody may have put it a week ago or a year ago. Utilizing those bins can really help that and providing that information on the floor so they're not having to go back to a specific computer in the front of the warehouse and then go searching again for that. A third way to win in your warehouse is to improve your inventory management with pallet license plating. We call it pallet tracking. It's also known as license plating. It's a way to group and manage inventory items at a pallet or some sort of common container level. Pallet tracking can be used with any sort of container that's going to hold or group items, and it's not limited to pallets, even though that's one of the most common. Really, at the end of the day, it's just a serial number that's used to trace those items within that pallet or container throughout inventory or as it goes to the customer. It's also going to help those users perform transactions with a system more closely aligned to how they're typically physically interacting with the actual items within the warehouse. Pallet tracking is going to also provide those users with the ability to more easily and rapidly move the items with fewer scans. And it lets the system take care of the knowing where and what is on that pallet automatically. And this is just going to help those transactions that are being performed with a single process at that pallet level. And then in SYSPRO, you're going to see all those items removed at once from that specific pallet. Diving a little bit deeper into this, really nearly every customer that I've worked with interacts with inventory in some sense of a pallet or container. And there's sort of two key methods to how customers utilize pallet tracking within their warehouse. And sometimes it may be a mix of the two methods based on the actual process they're doing or the functions that they're working within. The first one that I really want to cover is a pallet with a single item, quantity, and a lot or serial on it. In this case, it usually starts with receiving in materials on pallets, whether it be from receiving a PO or job receipting and managing them downstream throughout your warehouse. I like to give the analogy of this really being that shrink wrapped pallet. Now, at some point, this pallet might actually be broken down and partially consumed. And in other cases, it may be the full pallet gets moved or consumed at once. A pallet really is going to be made up of the following data. You're going to have a status of that pallet. Is it in inventory? Was it issued to a job? Was it in inspection? Is it on hold? Whatever that might be. And then you're going to have a warehouse, a bin location, a stock item, a quantity, and possibly a lot or serial associated to the items on that pallet as well. And the benefit of this is RiteScan is going to automatically know all of those variables based on that single unique pallet ID or license plate. We often internally refer to this as single pallet mode, where you're interacting with that whole pallet, whether it be moving it, issuing it to a job, you might be performing a stock take, or you might be picking that whole pallet for a sales order. A perfect example of utilizing single pallets or license plate is with sort of your food customers, utilizing those pallets with a specific stock code on it, a quantity, and a lot number that can be job receipted in and then managed down the stream all the way to the pallets that were shipped to that specific customer. The next example focuses on mixed pallets, which is a single pallet with multiple items now. And this really focuses on two specific areas that customers will often use this. One is staging raw materials onto a pallet for a job, where a picker picks those materials for the job onto a specific pallet ID that will get moved and staged to be issued to that job. And the second is a similar concept, but it's staging finished goods onto a pallet for a sales order or multiple sales orders that are going to be shipped to a specific customer. This really helps provide that specific pallet information that your customers might be requesting for those shipments. Now you have access to that data. But in both cases, what it's really doing is the users are able to pick those items to a specific pallet ID that's going to better help them track those items that are grouped together and where they end up going, whether it be issuing it to that job or shipping it to that customer. It's going to match what those users are physically doing and how they might be processing that through the system. So one of the things that often is a challenge for customers is the visibility of those pallets or license plates. And now if you implement sort of a process like this, you're going to have that visibility into knowing where your pallets are at, what status they're in, what's on them, and where they're going. The next tip is really a spin-off of the old saying, work smarter, not harder. And it's a key. Another way you're really able to win within your warehouse today is to speed up your barcode scanning by scanning smarter. Some of you in the webinar today might not be using any system for barcoding or barcode scanning, whereas others might be already using a barcode scanning system and not taking advantage of some of these simple things that you can do to really make your users' lives easier out on the warehouse floor. And we're going to cover two big ones that can help people be smoother. The first is utilizing 2D barcodes. If you're one of the people on the call that does not currently utilize this, and you've had your customers request that you print a 2D barcode label on your products as you're producing them with a bunch of your customers' data on it, and you're not taking advantage of those same types of capabilities internally in your own warehouse, that's what we really want to talk about and how you can change that. We get a lot of questions about the barcodes and the differences between 1D barcodes, 2D barcodes, RFID tags. How do I print barcodes? What data is in a barcode? There's lots of those types of questions. But to put it simply, a 1D barcode is going to be harder to scan and they can't hold as much data. That's the simple difference. In the example that you see on screen, you're going to be able to see how often when using a 1D barcode scan, you will have a separate barcode for each of the data variables that are required to perform a transaction, whether it be in SYSPRO or riteScan or whatever solution you're using. So you'll see there you have the stock code, the lot number, and the quantity. When utilizing a 2D barcode, we're able to put all three of those pieces of data into that single barcode. That way, when I scan that barcode, riteScan knows all three data variables automatically, and it can scan it easily. And this takes your users from having to possibly scan 2 to 3 barcodes to perform a transaction down to 1. So essentially, at the end of the day, utilizing 2D barcodes or putting multiple pieces of data into a single barcode is going to help reduce that amount of scanning by more than 50% likely. The second one, this is a fun one for me. The second way to speed up your barcode scanning is to take a good look at the hardware that you're using in your warehouse. I know that it can seem like an unnecessary expense because it still works, but think how often you replace your cell phone or your computers and you update to the latest and greatest and how fast that technology can get outdated. Well, the same goes with the hardware being used in the warehouse, and users may be using these devices all day, every day. It is quite amazing some of the devices that are still out there being used day in and day out and how old they are. But we want to make sure we can help the end users do their job as efficient as possible, and not investing in good devices is going to show at the end of the day. I actually have more stories also about old hardware, and we'll talk about a couple of them today. But if you spend some time out on the warehouse floor working and watching what the warehouse users will deal with, uh, it can be quite impressive what they'll put up with. For example, I was on a recent customer that I visited that only had a few handheld devices, but most of them were junk. And basically, when the devices wouldn't work, their solution to get it to work was to bang it on the desk or the pallet racking, which would solve the problem and it would get it to work again. Now, we all know this is not going to make the actual problem better down the road, but it's what they did to keep going and picking orders all day. With the opening discussion of high turnover and finding workers and being able to make sure we are able to keep them, putting the right tools in their hands to do their job well is one way we can do that. So we also want to talk about what are some of the things to consider when evaluating hardware. The types of handhelds that you're using in your warehouse can make a big difference in how quickly and accurately your operators can scan barcodes and access the information that they need to do their job. Older handhelds may prevent you from using 2D barcodes within your operations, and not only that, their scanning distance, speed, and accuracy are much lower than newer devices. Some of you still might be running the Windows mobile devices and finding it hard to even find those units to purchase because Microsoft marked the end of life on that almost over 2 years ago now. The other questions to ask yourself are your operators as efficient as they could be? Or is the old hardware slowing them down from doing their job? Does the cost of the hardware, investing in hardware, really outweigh the productivity gains that you can see? I want to share an important story about one of our customers, because sometimes it can be difficult to justify that cost of investing in hardware because it is expensive. One of our customers, they actually may be on the call today and recognize themselves as I go through this story, but there were really two key justifications and takeaways from evaluating investing in hardware. The first is for any IT member on this call, if you've worked with the old Windows handheld devices, you will understand the pain of having to update an application on them or manage them in general. And this customer had a lot of devices out on the floor. And if they wanted to perform an update to RiteScan, it could nearly take them booking off a full weekend to be able to perform the update and verify that each of the devices were updated as well as back up and running correctly. Now, there's also device management solutions out there to help with those things, but it can still be a pain with some of those older devices. The second takeaway, which is the most important in my eyes, was we were working with their picking team out on the floor, and we had a new Android device, and we also had the old Windows mobile device that were running the same version of RiteScan. And they've been using these devices forever. The customer wasn't actually taking advantage of features like lot suggestions or picking suggestions. So they would actually look up lots for each line that they were picking, which would show them the list of lots that was sorted by FIFO so they knew which lot and where to pick it from. Now, typically this wouldn't be a big deal, but the old handheld could take anywhere from 20 to 60 seconds to load the list of lots depending on the stock code. In comparison, when we were standing out there, we tested this exact same workflow on the new Android devices, which loaded within a second or two. Now, to the users, it wasn't really a big deal how long it was taking to load the list on the old devices. It was just how the system always worked. So when we start to cost justify the investment in the hardware, this was just likely one of the examples among others of where that device was really slowing them down. If a picker is picking 20 to 50 lines a day multiplied by 20 pickers across 2 shifts, that wasted time really starts to add up. And it doesn't take long to justify that investment. And not only that, it also makes them do their job easier. And at the end of the day, we want to find a way to increase our efficiency in the warehouse while still being accurate and making it easier for the operators to do their job. So now that we've talked about 5 quick things that you can do to win in your warehouse, I also want to take a minute to show you what the transaction processes can look like and how you might be able to put some of these concepts into use if you're using a warehouse solution like RiteScan. All right, I'm going to go ahead and log into RiteScan here, and we're going to kind of cover some different concepts that we talked about early on. The first being pallet tracking and how you can tie pallets into the different process flows. We're going to also go through how do you utilize or consume SmartScan, along with picking an order, utilizing suggested bins, and then another concept called tasks to help automate some tasks like replenishing a bin location as well. So the first thing I want you to see before we dive in is really what is a pallet and what is a pallet made up of. So if I go take a look here, we were talking about it earlier, right? A pallet is an ID that has a location and a status. And when I take a look at this pallet, I'm also able to see the items that are on the pallet, the history of that pallet, of when it was created, where it went, how all of those process flows associated to it. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to actually convert over to the mobile version so you can see what these processes look like from a mobile perspective. So one of the things where we were talking about earlier was staging a pallet for a job or work in progress. So at this point, if you have a specific job, you're able to scan that job and it's going to pull up that bill of materials. I can go ahead and generate a pallet ID, or I could utilize an existing license plate tag that might be out there. I'm going to put in my warehouse that I'm working in, and this is going to guide that operator through picking that materials list from your bill of materials onto that pallet so we can do something with it later on. So I can go ahead and scan my stock code, my quantity that I'm putting onto the pallet, and you'll notice it turns green and I can move on to the next item that I want to put onto that pallet. Put in my quantity, go ahead and add it. Now, once you've added these items to the pallet, this is that multi-item pallet that we were talking about, where when I complete this, now I can do something. Do I want to transfer it to a WIP staging location? And if I do that bin transfer, it's now going to move all of those items at once, just simply by utilizing that pallet ID. If I wanted to issue those items that I staged onto that pallet directly to the associated job, I could also issue those pallet items directly onto that job, consuming that from here as well. So it really just helps match the workflow that an operator might be going through as they're grabbing those materials and preparing them for a job or for a sales order that's going out the door. In the same sense, we talked that pallets typically come into inventory at PO receiving or job receiving, where inventory is coming in. So in that same sense, if I wanted to receipt a job with a quantity on it, I can tell the system where it's going, and I can perform this receipt, and that's going to receipt that pallet in. Now, you don't have to use pallets, but if I want to enable pallets, now I can begin to actually generate and receipt those items onto that new pallet or an existing pallet that I might already have in inventory at this point as well. The next thing we really want to talk about is SmartScan. Sorry, I should be slowing down a little bit here. You can also print those pallet labels. So as you complete that process, you'll often be printing that pallet label. The other thing we want to cover is going to be SmartScan. So when we talked about SmartScan, what it really is consuming that barcode label that has multiple pieces of data in it. So the most common example is going to be a barcode that has the stock code, the lot number, and the quantity in it. And that's what I'll be showing you here today. So I actually have a barcode that has all three pieces of that data in it. And what you'll notice is I'm going to put in my bin location, and then I'm going to go ahead and scan my barcode. Now I scanned one barcode, but what you'll notice is it put in that stock code for me, it put in that quantity for me, and it put in that lot number for me with one scan versus having to individually scan each of those. So I'm going to go ahead and scan my bin I'm moving it to, and I can go ahead and post that transaction utilizing a feature like SmartScan where you're able to put those multiple pieces of data into that single barcode. The other subject that I want to cover, which is probably most relevant to what we talked about with the poll, was how do I increase my receiving or picking accuracy and efficiency? So with order picking, this is going to help guide those operators through what orders should I be picking, how do I efficiently pick those items? So if I go ahead and select my order that I want to begin picking, what you'll notice here is RiteScan has actually ordered or sorted those lines based on that bin location, being alphanumeric. So as I'm walking through my facility, rather than showing the lines in the order that they were entered, which would be line 1, line 2, and line 3, it's going to sort them based on that bin location, E100, E400, E500, so I can go in order. If you take advantage of things like order management, where you can consolidate the multiple sales orders together, now you can group things even more, bringing even more lines into a single pick list or single pick workflow. So at this point, the operator is going to be able to go ahead and scan their item that they're picking. If they want to palletize it at this point, so if I wanted to put it onto a pallet for the sales order, I can scan my pallet ID that I want to put it onto, and now it's going to start to group those items. So when I go ahead and I scan my next item, it's going to validate that, and I can put it onto that same pallet ID that I'm creating for this customer and go through that pick process until I'm complete. So you'll notice it's not letting me complete this order until I pick all the lines to the expected quantities. So I'm going to just pick that last line item, and I'm going to put it onto that pallet and go ahead and pick this and complete this workflow. Now, a couple of things. Not only did we do the suggestion process where they know what and where to pick, it's also going to palletize those items. So if I need to build any sort of reporting of what pallets am I sending to a specific customer or anything like that, you have access to that information now going forward. One of the other features that can be really helpful is for taking advantage of your sort of pick face areas, right? Or how do I get my materials into those pick face areas and replenish them efficiently so that way I don't have somebody going to pick something and there's not enough stock there. One of the things you can do to help with that is things like tasks, where you can automate the creation of tasks to direct users to replenishing locations or doing a warehouse transfer, whatever it might be. So you can see here, I actually have 4 tasks assigned to me, and it's going to direct that operator what they should be doing. So if I go ahead and select this high priority task here, it's going to tell me a replenishment of a pick bin, E100. It's going to tell me what stock code to grab. It can tell me what quantities to grab, where to grab it from, and how to process that. So I'm going to go ahead and proceed. It's going to ask me to validate the stock code that I'm pulling and the location I'm putting it to. And then I can go ahead and proceed, and it's going to link directly to that bin transfer transaction to move what the system told me to move. And I can go ahead and post that and process that task, and you're going to notice that it goes out of my list at that point in time. Now, that was just a quick sort of very high-level demo of some of the features and how you can take advantage of them in comparison to some of the quick tips that we talked about and how they actually apply. With that being said, I'm going to transition back over and we're going to open it up for questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ryan. You covered a lot of ground. Great tips. If you have any questions, feel free to add them to the questions panel in the on your right-hand side of your screen. And Ryan, as you were doing your presentation, we did have a bunch of questions come in, so I'm just gonna start firing away, and we'll see how many we can tackle in the next 5 or 6 minutes, if that's okay.
Sounds good. Fire away.
All right. So Ryan, is RiteScan 8 a web app or a mobile app?
So RiteScan 8 is a web app that is also optimized for mobile devices to run on mobile devices.
Okay, awesome. There are a few questions here about the RiteScan compatibility with the SYSPRO versions. So can you cover that as well, please?
Yes. So RiteScan 8, which is our new version of RiteScan, is compatible with SYSPRO 7 and 8. We also have RiteScan 6, which is our older product that is actually compatible with SYSPRO 6.1, SYSPRO 7, and SYSPRO 8.
Okay, perfect. All right. There's a question here from Peter. Are Motorola scanners recommended over touchscreen scanners without physical keyboards?
The Motorola's were bought out by Zebra most likely, if that's the ones you're referring to. But in terms of the scanning devices, often I wouldn't say that there's a preference of whether you have the on-screen keyboard or the physical keypad. Sometimes it comes down to the manufacturing environment. If you're in more of like a metal fab, a dirtier type environment, I would go with the physical keypad if it were me, just because there's gloves, there's people touching screens, just isn't as nice if they need to touch the screen. But we're seeing a transition to more and more people that are utilizing the phone style handheld scanners with the on-screen keyboards. And hopefully the more scanning you implement, the less you need to even interact with that keyboard.
Yeah, makes total sense. All right, so Adam sent this one in when you were doing the demo. So his question was, once you do the whip staging and issue the job, is the palette information then lost?
Nope. So when we talked about the statuses of the palette, basically, if I were to issue that whole palette after staging it for WIP, I'm going to still have reporting visibility to see that the status of that palette was changed to issued to WIP. So a customer or a user is not going to be able to be able to do an inventory movement or anything because it's going to validate that status, but you're able to still report on it from a reporting standpoint or see what happened and what job it was issued to.
Perfect. Let's see, I'm just going through them here. There's a lot of questions. For mixed palettes, does RiteScan effectively build a palette based on cubes of different items on the palette?
If you're referring to cubing the palettes out based on dimensions, RiteScan doesn't necessarily guide the users in that cubing procedure. But as you're going through and adding those items to the palettes, it's more of a manual user-driven process that they can go through those picks and start to build out that palette. But we're not doing the cubing measurements of saying what could go on the palette.
Perfect. Here's a question from Mark. How are the palette numbers stored? Is this a custom form field in SYSPRO, or is it a kind of a RiteScan field?
So palettes are specific to RiteScan. However, it can be tied in with SYSPRO in a couple of different ways. So RiteScan holds the palettes in its own SQL, but you are able to turn on settings that can link those palette IDs to transactions in a custom form on SYSPRO, or utilizing like the note and reference fields. But there's also ways that you can create views in SYSPRO. There's sort of a prepackaged view that can allow you to query the palettes directly in SYSPRO, where you can query by show me all the palettes with this item on it, or show me all the palettes that were shipped on this sales order. So you do have some of those query capabilities that can be tied into SYSPRO, but it is a RiteScan feature.
Okay, great. So we're getting short on time, so I'm just going to ask maybe one or two more questions here. Are bin locations set up and managed through RiteScan?
So bins are actually set up and managed in SYSPRO, and all of your bin logic directly comes into SYSPRO. So for example, if you turn on multiple bins and fixed bins in SYSPRO, all of that logic comes directly into RiteScan from your SYSPRO system. So it is really tying into the SYSPRO bin system with RiteScan.
Okay, awesome. And I'm going to ask one last question here. So can labels be generated when using the palette reports? For example, generate an inventory list for a palette and then to stick it on the palette.
Yep. So typically we work with solutions like Bartender or Nice Label. That'll actually be your solution you use to design the label. But basically, RiteScan can feed that data and tie back to it for printing those palette labels at different process flows.
Perfect. Well, that's great, Ryan. Thanks so much. We have a ton of questions that have come in. If we didn't get a chance to answer your question, we will definitely loop back after the webinar and make sure that that we get all of your questions answered for you. Thanks so much, Ryan, for spending some time with us today. It was really, really informative and insightful. And thanks to all of you for attending. If you have any questions or want to learn more about how RiteScan can help your business, please feel free to reach out to Ryan or reach out to your account manager at SYSPRO or one of our partners. Thanks again for your time and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.